In our history, we have now arrived at the decade of 1870. And the decade of 1870 strikes me as a decade when many things were invented. This is when the first typewriters were manufactured, and Alexander Graham Bell invented the first telephone, depicted at the top of the screen, and Thomas Edison, depicted on the left-hand side of the screen, he invented the phonograph player and the incandescent light bulb. Or, actually, it would probably be more accurate to say that Edison's research team invented these things, because Edison had a research lab at Menlo Park, New Jersey. He was often called the Wizard of Menlo Park, and at his lab he had several employees. Now, prior to Edison, there were electric lights, but they just weren't practical to use. For example, one type of light was called an arc light that made light from an electric arc. But these were too bright to be used indoors, and they needed a tremendous amount of electricity. So at this time, people knew that if electricity was passed through a thin wire, the wire would glow and make light. The problem was that the wire would also quickly melt. So Edison's team was trying to find a type of filament that, when placed in a vacuum bulb, would not melt. And I believe they tried thousands of things before they finally discovered something that worked. The decade of 1870 saw the end of radical Reconstruction. To the extent that black people had gained a portion of political control during the few years of radical Reconstruction after the Civil War, white people in the South effectively stamped it out and established absolute control. It's often believed that the Union won the Civil War, and that the war ended in 1865 when Lee surrendered. However, it might be more accurate to say that the war continued for several years after Lee's surrender, where white Southerners pursued a program of terrorism and a kind of guerrilla warfare, and they violently resisted radical Reconstruction, and this essentially ended in a compromise. White Southerners, on one hand, they agreed to accept the elimination of formalized slavery, and Northerners, they got tired of the violence in the South, and they agreed to allow white Southerners the freedom to oppress black people and maintain political power by whatever means they deemed necessary. One example of this violence was a massacre that occurred in Colfax, Louisiana in 1872. So Colfax is located in Grant Parish, Louisiana, and during radical Reconstruction, Republicans, including black politicians, had political control of the parish. Then in 1872, there was a group of about 140 white Southerners, including one group called the Knights of the White Camellia, and another group called the Old Time Ku Klux Klan, and also several Confederate veterans. And this group of white Southerners, they were armed with guns, they had a cannon, and they marched toward the courthouse in the town of Colfax, murdering black people along the way. So then a large group of black people in Colfax attempted to defend the courthouse, but they had limited ammunition. The attackers overwhelmed the black defenders. They set fire to the courthouse and forced them to surrender. Then the black men, they were lined up, and one by one they were either shot, or their throats were slit, or they were hung. Estimates are that between 70 and 165 black people were killed in the massacre. And here is a picture of a historical marker placed in Colfax marking the site of the massacre, and it gives a rather disturbing example of the ways in which white people have attempted to rewrite history to excuse their racism. It says, on this site occurred the Colfax riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. So instead of describing the event as a violent racist massacre, It described it as an event where white people put down a riot and ended misrule of black people in the South. Now, I seek to be someone who is aware of racism as it exists today, and I want to be someone who has, to the best of my ability, an appreciation of the long-term effects of racism and the extent to which the United States suffers from racism at the current point in time. But I must confess that I still felt somewhat shocked when just a few moments ago I did a search using Google Earth, and I zoomed in and I could see that this marker is still standing. It is things like this that illustrate the need for people, and maybe especially white people as myself, to know the history of racism. The more I learn about the history, the more I understand about the profound influence it still has today. Now, by the time of the Civil War, the United States had mostly subjugated, removed, or killed the Native American people living on the eastern half of the continent. So then, over the next few decades after the Civil War, the United States fought several wars to remove Native American people from the western half of the continent, to kill them or place them in reservations. And by the end of this decade, by the end of the 1870s, this will have been mostly accomplished. One example of this was the Sand Creek Massacre. It occurred in Colorado in 1864, so that's actually in the previous decade, just as the Civil War was ending. What happened was that an officer named John Chivington, he led about 700 troops to attack a village of Cheyenne people. And this was in spite of the fact that the village was actually abiding by terms of a recent truce made with the United States, and they were flying a United States flag. At the time of the attack, the people in the village were mostly women and children because a majority of the healthy young men were out hunting. So then, in an early morning surprise attack, Chivington's men slaughtered the inhabitants. That is, they slaughtered mostly women, children, babies, and older men. The victims, almost entirely unarmed with no means of defense, pleaded for surrender, but to no avail. About 200 were killed. And then the soldiers, they mutilated bodies, they cut off scalps, fingers, and they cut off genitals of both men and women to save as trophies. Another battle was the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana in 1876. Here, George Armstrong Custer led a United States cavalry of several hundred men, and they attacked a large Lakota encampment. But a large group of Lakota warriors, led by a man named Crazy Horse, counterattacked. By the way, when I tell the story, I'm not quite clear why it is that people in the United States military are always called soldiers, and people in Native American military are called warriors. Anyway, for whatever reason, in this case, the Lakota warriors killed Custer and most of his cavalry. And now the Lakota were the ones who were victorious, and the Lakota were the ones cutting off body parts to use as trophies. The picture on the screen is a drawing of Custer's defeat made by a Lakota Native American who witnessed the event. Notably, after Custer's defeat, the United States increased its resolve to defeat Native Americans. So the Battle of Little Bighorn was one of the last major battles ever to be won by Native Americans. One of the last Native American groups to be placed on a reservation was the Nez Perce Nation. In the decade of 1870, the Nez Perce were led by Chief Joseph, depicted on your screen. The Nez Perce were originally friendly with the white people, and if you recall from the story of Lewis and Clark, they were the ones that saved the Lewis and Clark expedition. And as indicated by Chief Joseph's name, which is Joseph, they adopted some aspects of white culture. So a few decades previously, in 1855, they signed a treaty whereby they agreed to live on a reservation in Oregon. But then, in 1875, the United States withdrew from that treaty and demanded that the Nez Perce move to a small reservation in Idaho that would reduce their land by about 90%. But when faced with United States cavalry, Chief Joseph realized he had no choice, and he began to move his people to the new location. However, there were a few young Nez Perce men who went out and attacked some white settlements. And in response, the United States cavalry, they moved to attack the Nez Perce. So the Nez Perce fled, and the cavalry pursued them. Now the Nez Perce, they knew the terrain, and they were very skilled at maneuvering through the mountains. So they were able to stay ahead of the cavalry actually for several months. They fled through Idaho, through Yellowstone Park, up through Montana, and almost to the Canadian border, where they were finally caught and Chief Joseph surrendered. The Nez Perce were then forced to live in Oklahoma. Chief Joseph spent many years lobbying the United States government trying to get their land back, but he never persuaded them to do so.
A flower petal falls on a mighty sea, deep blue and surging waves swell endlessly. The clouds are lit by sunlight.
It was also in this decade, in 1872, when John Gast paints his painting titled American Progress, which is depicted here, and you may recognize that I use a portion of this painting in the title slide for the series. And this painting gives us a good impression of how white people may have viewed the westward expansion of the United States. It illustrates an idealistic and myopic view that white people had at the time, and that many people still have today. It includes this enlightened woman who is floating across the sky with a book that probably symbolizes enlightenment, and she's stringing telegraph wire that probably symbolizes progress. This suggests that white people are bringing a type of enlightenment and technical progress that is good for the land. The Native American people seem to be content in the picture, just walking away. There are no armies fighting them, no bloody battles, no genocide. The railroad is behind the people. In truth, the railroads came first. They were subsidized by the government, and then railroad companies sold land that they advertised to entice people to move west. The picture also includes an idyllic scene of men plowing the ground for a farm. In truth, most of the Great Plains, especially land west of the 100th meridian, most of this land was too dry for successful farming. White people that attempted to establish homesteads and farm this land faced years of hardship, frequent drought, and poverty, and they usually ended up abandoning their farms. Now, let's take a moment to get an update on what is happening in Europe and around Prussia at this time. Recall that Bismarck had consolidated all the German states under Prussian control. So now, in the year 1870, Bismarck wants to expand his power further, and so he intentionally draws France into a war. And so consequently, there is a war between France and Prussia. The picture on your screen is one that was taken during that war. And this war did not go well for France, and France suffered a humiliating defeat. So, as a result of losing the war, France was forced to pay a large sum of money to Prussia and also to cede territory to Prussia. And specifically, the area circled on the map that includes Alsace and Lorraine was the land that France was forced to give to Prussia. And this is actually a very notable event, because this created lasting tension between the two countries. And as we will see, eventually, this will have major consequences for world history in the years to come. A notable book published during the decade of 1870 is a book titled Criminal Man, published by the person depicted at the bottom of the screen, Cesare Lombroso. The book continued the tradition of physiognomy. Recall that physiognomy is the tradition of using people's physical appearance to make judgment about personality. Some of the illustrations from this book are depicted on the screen. For example, the person depicted as being similar to a pig is supposed to be a criminal, and the person depicted as being similar to a lion is supposed to be an upright citizen. Not surprisingly, this book also presented very racist ideas. Lombroso connected criminal behavior with dark skin and also with an inability to blush. At one point, he even suggests that non-white men love to kill, manipulate the corpse, tear its flesh, and drink its blood. So, in Cesare Lombroso's book, the tradition of physiognomy continues. So, now at this point in our history, it has been over 10 years since Lister reported his results on antiseptic surgery, and antiseptic surgery is still controversial in the United States. This painting by Thomas Eakins depicts the renowned surgeon Dr. Samuel Gross performing a surgery without antisepsis at Bellevue Hospital in New York in 1876. As you see, there are students taking notes and a weeping mother behind him. Now, Dr. Gross was a famous surgeon in the United States, and he actually invited Lister to come to the United States and give a presentation on antiseptic surgery for a large medical conference. But his motivation might have been somewhat devious here, because he was apparently wanting to debunk Lister's theory on a grand stage. So in addition to inviting Lister, Gross also invited several skeptics of germ theory to question Lister on his methods. So after Lister gave his presentation, the skeptics offered their own methods for avoiding infection. They offered things like cold water and rest and something called the open air treatment. Of course, their evidence was all anecdotal in nature. In contrast, Lister's previously published findings, which I presume he presented at the conference, his work all provided empirical results. Specifically, in his work, he had a sample of about 75 people, and among those who received amputations before they started doing antiseptic surgery, 46% died. Then, after they started using antiseptic surgery, only 15% died. Now, on the one hand, this was not an experiment with random assignment, and it would be several decades yet before researchers realized the importance of random assignment. But on the other hand, the results are still relatively clear. Nonetheless, very few surgeons at the conference were persuaded. And this illustrates a key theme in the history of scientific progress. People are often not persuaded by empirical evidence. Even highly intelligent people hold tightly to beliefs they think are true. And this is an important lesson for us today, because if we think we are immune to this, we are bound to make the same types of mistakes. Now, interestingly, there was actually one person attending the conference who was persuaded and who did believe Lister. That was someone named Robert Wood Johnson. And after that conference, Johnson joined with his brother, who was also named Johnson, and they started a new company selling sterile bandages, and they named their company Johnson & Johnson. So, as I mentioned previously, Wilhelm Wundt is typically considered the first psychologist. And the way the story is told, the official beginning of psychology will occur with something that Wundt does near the end of this decade. That is, near the end of the decade of 1870. So now, at this point in our story, Wundt is getting very close to starting the new discipline of psychology, but we're not quite there yet. Now, recall that Wundt had previously published a book on sense perception that described the idea of psychology as a new discipline. So now, in 1874, he gets even closer to the new discipline of psychology by publishing a book called Physiological Psychology. And this book is entirely devoted to describing this new science of psychology. And note in the title, by physiological, he probably means the same thing as empirical or maybe experimental. So physiological psychology could also be interpreted empirical psychology. So his previous book merely outlined the idea, and this new book actually covers the topic of this new psychology. Now, this is not traditionally considered the start of psychology, but it could be considered the very first psychology book. So what's in this book? He has one section that covers brain anatomy and physiology, and then he has another section that covers sensation and perception. And in this book, he describes psychology as having a particular goal, and that goal is to study conscious process. So in this book, he defines psychology as the study of conscious process. So he publishes the book, and then in 1876, he gets a job as chair of a philosophy department at University of Leipzig. So recall that he was a TA for Helmholtz, and then he resigned from that position, and he didn't have any official academic position for a while. So now he's back in academics, and he has a position as of chair of the philosophy department at University of Leipzig. And there he's given a room in a building called the Convict Building at Leipzig. We'll see a picture of that a little later. It doesn't look like a very impressive building. I think it was built by convicts is why it was called the Convict Building. So he's given a room in this convict building. It might be more like a closet or something, but he's given this room that he can use to store some of his equipment he's using for his teaching. And that will become notable later on in our story. So Wilhelm Wundt is in Leipzig, and this map shows you where Leipzig is. It would be part of Prussia. That was the country that just defeated France in a war. And Wundt's research is sometimes described as a brass instrument approach to studying sensation and perception. Recall, this is similar to what Wundt was doing when he was a teaching assistant for Helmholtz. He used different contraptions to measure human sensation and perception. And all of his contraptions, all these fancy, shiny brass instruments, were probably the thing that made his work seem especially interesting to students. It probably seemed exciting to study human capabilities using these fancy, new scientific brass instruments. So to give some examples, let's take a look at some of the brass instruments Wundt would have used. So let's see. So here is a picture of a chronoscope, and a chronoscope is something that provides a very precise measure of time down to a fraction of a second. I believe it had some kind of weight that would fall, and then it could be activated and stopped to measure time very precisely. Up in the upper right-hand corner, there's a picture of a switch, and at this point in time, they would have had some basic electronic capabilities, I believe using a battery, where they could have a switch you would push to activate or to stop the chronoscope. So his lab would have used chronoscopes, would be a very common instrument in Wundt's lab. Here is a touchistoscope. That's often a bit of a tongue twister for me to say, but a touchistoscope is an instrument that presents visual stimuli for very precise periods of time. Like if you wanted to present a visual picture or a color or an image for just a fraction of a second, a touchistoscope presents that stimuli for a very precise period of time. And then what else? We've also got a kymograph. I'm not exactly sure how this works, but this is a machine or an instrument for measuring muscle contractions or other physiological processes. And I believe it can be fairly accurate in measuring very small muscle contractions. And I'm assuming there's some kind of piece of paper that maybe gets put on the drum as it turns and marks the strength of muscle contractions. So that's a kymograph.
Sunlight dancing on the crest
And now, let's return to our story of William James. If you recall, where we last left off, William James was unemployed, aimless, and living with his parents. And this is going to be the point where William's friend, Henry Bowditch, plays a key role. So if you recall, Henry Bowditch went to medical school with William James, and then Henry Bowditch went to Europe and studied with famous people like Charcot. So Henry Bowditch returns from Europe, and he gets a job teaching at Harvard. And Bowditch plans to set up a physiology lab at Harvard, and he invites his old friend William James to collaborate with him. So now William James finally has something to do. Moreover, not only does William work in Bowditch's lab, but he gets an offer to help co-teach a course at Harvard. So, in January 1873, William James teaches his very first course. At this point, note, William James, he's 31 years old. It is 12 years after he first enrolled in college, and his only degree, the only degree he got is his 1-year medical degree that he got several years ago. So anyway, he teaches his first course, and his course is a course in anatomy and physiology, and William did the physiology section of that course. There were 53 students, and William was paid $300. Notably, by now, his brother Harry had already become a successful and somewhat famous author and was making about 10 times that amount of money. But for William, things actually continued to go well. And so eventually he was given the offer to teach the whole course in the fall all by himself. William was excited and he accepted the offer. Things were going well. But then, over the summer, he began to worry about how he was feeling, and he changed his mind, and he decided that he needed to turn down the offer and go back to Europe to rest and recover. He described his condition as having a, quote, weakness of nerve. So he was suffering some more ailments, and so he turned the job down, and he went to London and Paris and Florence and Rome. But maybe fortunately for psychology, Harvard still held the job offer for him, and when William James returned to Cambridge the next year, he took the job and he began teaching his very own anatomy and physiology course. Here is another picture of William James. As you may note, we have lots of pictures of William James. So anyway, after William James had been teaching his anatomy and physiology course for about a year, he wrote a letter to the president of Harvard University, and in this letter he proposed a brand new course in psychology. William stated that this new course would cover what he called mental science, which he described as the study of the human mind, its laws, its powers, and the authority of its conclusions. He described this proposed new course as being a combination of physiology and philosophy, which he said would be a, quote, union of the two disciplines. Notably, he justified the course by stating that Wilhelm Wundt was doing something very similar in Germany. And as it turned out, he got permission to teach this new course. And so the next year, 1876, Wilhelm Wundt begins teaching a new graduate course in psychology. And so this could be considered the very first psychology course taught in the United States. It is also around this time that William James gets married to Alice Gibbons. Interestingly, we have letters from the time of their courtship that show us some of the relationship struggles they may have experienced. So, for example, William told Alice at one point that he was unhealthy and unfit to be a husband. He once wrote to a friend saying, "She thinks of me no more than a dead leaf." And at one time he wrote to Alice saying, "You, sitting self-contained and self-supported at a distance, not needing me. You will have some day to recognize me, to respect me, to admit that whatever our feelings may be, our beings, after all, have something in common, something to say to each other." So anyway, whatever that courtship was like, eventually Alice and William got married in 1878. Notably, one story is that William James took work with him on their honeymoon, and specifically he worked on a book that would eventually become the very first psychology textbook in the United States. Now, before you go and accuse William James of being unromantic, I suppose I should note that their honeymoon was 10 weeks long. So I suppose if your honeymoon's 10 weeks, maybe it's okay to bring work along. Now, one person that was not at the wedding between William James and Alice Gibbons was William's sister, also named Alice. Recall that the James family had a very repressive attitude towards women, and James' sister, Alice, had lifelong difficulties with depression. Sometimes she was suicidal, and she also had frequent various physical complaints and ailments that she often complained about. James' sister Alice appeared to have a strong desire for education. She wanted to read and learn. However, because she was female, she was denied these opportunities. At several points, she was given a diagnosis of hysteria, and hysteria was a very common diagnosis for women at the time, and her symptoms were presumed to be caused by too much stimulation of the nervous system, which was a very common assumption at the time. So she was prescribed seclusion and rest, which may have only exacerbated her difficulties. So Alice would have been 13 years old when William married, and at that time she became too depressed to attend their wedding. Some people have noted the similarities between the two Alices, and some people have speculated that William's sister was depressed because she felt that her relationship with her brother was threatened by his new wife. Whatever the cause, it does illustrate her struggles with depression. Also, in addition to being a victim of sexism, there's reason to think that William's sister Alice and also William's brother Henry, the author, that they were lesbian and gay in their sexual attractions. Neither sibling expressed an interest in heterosexual relationships or marriage. Neither one ever got married. Alice, later on in her life, she had a female companion for many years. And Henry, the author, he had several male friends, and he often wrote them affectionate letters. This is something that actually the surviving family members tried to hide for many years after his death, but eventually these letters became known. Now, of course, at the time, people did not have a concept of sexual orientation, and people did not identify as being gay or lesbian, and same-sex attractions and sexual behavior in general were not discussed in public. So it's hard to know what Alice or Henry really felt or what types of prejudices they may have experienced. But in pondering their experience, we can try to imagine what life would have been like at that time for people who were not men and for people who did not desire heterosexual relationships. And then one final note is that William's sister Alice, she actually died at a fairly young age from breast cancer when she was in her 40s. Now let's return to our story of Stanley Hall. And at this point, many of the stories I've been telling you are all going to get tied together. So if you recall, where we last left Stanley Hall, he was teaching at Antioch College in Ohio. So Hall decides to resign from his teaching position and to pursue further education. Some sources suggest that he had become interested in the new idea of psychology that was developing. So anyway, in 1876, Hall enrolls at Harvard as a graduate student. Now recall, at this time, graduate education is still brand new in the United States. And so Hall actually became the very first student to complete the graduate program in philosophy at Harvard University. And who did Hall study with at Harvard? Well, he worked in Bowditch's lab, and he took courses with William James. So in 1878, Hall completes his PhD at Harvard, and he does her dissertation on the role of muscle cues in space perception, which was the very first PhD ever awarded by the philosophy department at Harvard, and it was the first PhD in the United States on a psychological topic. So then after graduating, Hall goes on to Germany to complete postdoctoral work with none other than Wilhelm Wundt. So this brings us back to our story of Wilhelm Wundt. And now I'm ready to tell you the thing that Wundt did that is typically considered the official beginning for the new academic discipline of psychology. Recall that Wundt was a brand new chair of the philosophy department at University of Leipzig, and he had been given a room in the convict building at Leipzig to store his equipment. And that convict building is depicted on your screen now. And his equipment included a lot of brass instruments, things like Touchistoscopes and Chronoscopes and electrical stimulators and pendulums and timers and things like that. Now, initially, he just used this equipment for teaching. But in 1879, he used this equipment to conduct a research study. And this was not any ordinary research study. This was a study specifically intended to be a psychology research study, and it was conducted at a university, and it was not part of a teaching demonstration. And for these reasons, Wundt later designated this particular study as the official beginning to the new discipline of psychology. And since then, everyone has generally accepted this designation. So, 1879 is traditionally regarded as the beginning of psychology. It's the year that Wundt conducted what is called the first psychology research study. And note, Stanley Hall from the United States was there when it happened.
As now a spirit moving glides over water deep and blows this breath of life briefly we keep gold strings of light revealing, showing all that's good. Dark mystery hides a power just dimly understood. Peace fills the salty air.
And what was this first research study that Wundt conducted? Well, Wundt was interested in something he called apperception. And apperception is somewhat like attention, or maybe bringing something into conscious awareness. And his main hypothesis for his study was that apperception of simple stimuli should take longer than apperception of complex stimuli. And he tested this by measuring people's reaction times to different types of stimuli. So who were the participants or the subjects in this research study? Well, they included just 4 people. They were Wilhelm Wundt himself, Stanley Hall from the United States, and 2 other doctoral students. And I'll say more about this in a moment, but one thing we'll note about Wundt's research is that his participants were usually experts and not people drawn from the general public. So they tested the reaction times to different types of stimuli. So for example, they had a flash of light to colors or digits that varied in the number of digits or varied in the number of colors that were presented to test how quickly they could react or identify when a stimulus had been presented. And their general conclusion was that indeed more complex stimuli take longer to apperceive, although I'm sure their methods would not really hold up to today's standards. On the screen is a famous picture of Wundt demonstrating one of his research studies. I'm not exactly sure what the study is, but they're demonstrating some kind of reaction time experiment. It's actually Wilhelm Wundt himself is a participant. He's in the very middle. He's the one that has the beard there in the middle there. And he's got his hands on 2 switches that it looks like they're going to test some kind of reaction time, where probably if it's this, he's supposed to flick the right switch, and if it's something else, he's going to press the left switch. So they're testing his reaction time. And notably, if you look over on the left, you see there's a chronoscope sitting on the desk over there. So this is a famous picture of Wilhelm Wundt conducting one of his research studies. So, if Wundt was the first psychologist, what exactly was his theory of psychology? Much of his work focused on understanding conscious experience, and his theory could be called constructionist because it describes conscious experience as something that is not determined by outside forces, but rather something that people actively construct. So in sum, Wundt's theory can be described as a constructionist focus on trying to understand attention and perception. And as I mentioned, Wundt was especially interested in trying to understand something he called apperception. And so he had a theory of apperception, and part of this was the idea that there are two levels of conscious experience. And one level might be the lowest level, would be the level of all things perceived, and then the higher level would be the level of apperception. And apperception includes the things that people bring into focal awareness. So the lower level is just all the stuff you perceive. Apperception is the stuff you bring into focal awareness. And Wundt thought that apperception was dictated by the voluntary will. In other words, that goes back to the constructionist idea that people construct their own experience. That is, they construct their own apperception. It's dictated by the voluntary will. So with Wundt's theory, conscious experience depends on desires and feelings and urges and motivations. Now, notably, Wundt's theory is often mistakenly identified as something called structuralism. In fact, I still see textbooks today that make this claim. But as we will see later in our story, Wundt will soon have a student named Edward Titchener, and Titchener will eventually move to the United States, and Titchener will promote a theory called structuralism. And Titchener's structuralism involves an effort to try to identify the basic components or the basic structure of conscious experience. Now, Titchener was a student of Wundt, and Titchener claimed to be a follower of Wundt, and he claimed that his structuralism was the same thing as Wundt's theory. And for many years, people believed him, and they thought that was true. In part, this is probably because Wundt wrote in German, and so he didn't write in English. And the very first person that wrote a history of psychology textbook was actually one of Titchener's students. And notably, Titchener's student had a last name of Boring. And maybe if you're going to write a history of psychology textbook, the name Boring might be an appropriate name for such a person. But anyway, as it turns out, Titchener's structuralism was much more mechanical than Wundt's theory. So with structuralism, Titchener sought to identify components of conscious experience, just like a chemistry table has elements. And so the idea was that conscious experience would be determined by law-governed interactions between these components. So just like the elements on a chemistry table, just like chemistry elements are governed, have law-governed rules that govern their interactions, so too Titchener wanted to understand how there was law-governed interactions between the components of conscious experience. In contrast, Wundt had, as we just talked about, Wundt had that constructionist approach where he thought that conscious experience was shaped by desires and feelings and urges and strivings and motivations. So we know now that it would be a mistake to equate Wundt's theory with structuralism. And here is another picture of Wundt demonstrating one of his research studies. That's Wundt sitting at the chair, and on the table in front of him you see a chronoscope and some switches for testing reaction times. So exactly what type of methods did Wundt use for his research? As I mentioned a moment ago, one distinctive feature of Wundt's research is that he never used large samples of people drawn from the general public. Instead, he used small samples of men who were experts in observing and measuring their own perceptive processes. So participants in Wundt's studies were all experts, like Wundt himself and his top graduate students. They were not untrained people from the general public. Wundt probably would have thought, he would probably argue, for example, that if you wanted to understand how people experience emotion, you need to have participants who are all well trained in observing their own emotion. Wundt might think it odd that Today, we give questionnaires to people asking about their emotions when the participants have no special training or qualification to give us valid answers. Now, the reason that Wundt took this approach is related to the fact that Wundt was part of that German Foundation for Academic Psychology. And recall that part of that German foundation involved an interest in trying to identify processes in sensation and perception that are common to all people. So, Wundt was primarily interested in identifying processes in perception that are common to all people. And so he was not so much interested in trying to understand individual differences between people. So, if you assume you are studying a process that's common to all people, there's really no need for a large sample of people drawn from the general public, because presumably the best data might come from someone who is well trained to observe that common process of perception that's common to all people. Now, of course, one drawback to this approach is that when well-trained experts participate in a study, that means all the participants know what the hypothesis is, and it means all the participants are invested in the study coming out as expected. So the study can become kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Everyone knows what's supposed to come out, and they might make it come out that way. And this makes it especially difficult to provide a valid test of hypotheses. It can also lead to a kind of circular reasoning, because if a graduate student fails to produce expected results, the student could simply be accused of not having sufficient level of training. So, in line with things I mentioned previously, Wundt's research often involved things like measuring reaction times, and he often conducted research using his brass instruments to measure sensation and perception. So reaction times, brass instruments were two key things he used. And then another technique I haven't talked so much about yet, but he also used something called introspection. And so introspection is a process where a trained research participant simply observes his own conscious experience. For example, a person might be exposed to a stimulus, maybe a metronome ticking, and the person would then simply describe his conscious experience. So based on studies using this process of introspection, Wundt concluded that conscious experience includes two basic components, or two basic things, and these were sensations and feelings. So he decided that based on introspection, based on his experts trying to observe their own conscious experience, he concluded that conscious experience includes two basic parts. One part is sensations, and the other part is feelings. And then further research on this, he identified three types of feelings, which he called pleasure, strain, and excitement, were the three parts, three dimensions of feelings that he identified using this process of introspection. So that is what research was like in Wundt's lab. And finally, as I mentioned previously, Wundt was interested in something he called Volcker psychology. I think this could be roughly translated folk psychology. And this included an interest in things like language and religion and myth and cultural differences and customs and values. And in looking at Wundt's Volcker psychology, we can learn about his viewpoints regarding race. Now, part of his theory was that there are 4 levels of cultural development. So he thought these 4 levels were, the first level was primitive man, and then the second level was something he called the totemistic age, I guess where people worshipped totems. And then the next age was the age of heroes and gods. And then the highest stage is the development to humanity. So maybe not surprisingly, when Wundt gives examples of people fitting each stage, his examples reveal an underlying racism. So Wundt provides several examples of people living at the lower levels, and most of these examples involve people from Africa, and none of those examples involve people with white skin. In contrast, Wundt implied that Europeans were at the top level, and he also discussed Greek culture as being highly advanced. Now, on one hand, his racism was probably not quite as blatant as the polygenesis perspective that we talked about, that was proposed by many academics in the United States and many people in Europe as well. But still, Wundt's racism is readily apparent.